I love Seattle. David, thank you for that introduction. I'm really here to celebrate what you've accomplished. You have, at a time when a lot of people are discouraged around the country, frankly, in terms of the economy and their own efficacy, their own power to do anything about the economy, you here in Seattle have done something, and done something very significant, which is a trend setter around the country. I'm reminded how discouraged people are around America. I was coming back from this week from Knoxville, Tennessee. People come up to me in airports very often, because I'm kind of conspicuous looking. And they come up to me, and I don't know who they are, but they come up to me and they start, it's almost as if we've been in the middle of a conversation. And this person came up to me and said, "So what are we going to do?" I said, "I don't know." But it happens often, and it is kind of my own free-floating focus group in terms of the anxiety that's out there. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of feelings of powerlessness. For one thing, we are in, if you didn't already know it, we're in an economic recovery. I hear some skepticism. Well, the skepticism is deserved because this is the first economic recovery ever in history in terms of measurement where the median wage has actually dropped, adjusted for inflation. The median household income has dropped, adjusted for inflation. Now, this is unusual. You hear reports that the economy is doing well. We're having a lot of growth. Second quarter growth figures were just out. Very good. But if the median is going down, what's good about the growth? Or another way of putting it, many of you know the difference between average and median. Whenever an economist is talking about average wages or average incomes, watch your wallets. The basketball player Shaquille O'Neal and I have an average height of 6'1". Do you get my drift? You see, the people at the top pull up the average. So what you really want to look at in terms of understanding where the American economy is, in terms of the real success of the economy, is you want to look at the median wage. Not only individuals, but because a lot of households have more than one wage earner, you might want to look at household median income. And that is a problem, and it's getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, because in this recovery, 95% of all of the economic gains have gone to the top 1%. Now, when I say that, a lot of people accuse me of being a class warrior. I am not a class warrior. I'm a class worrier. There's one letter different, but it's very important. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think it's a matter of resenting anybody because they're wealthy. But you have to worry when the median starts going down. One reason the economy overall, yes, second quarter growth is good, first quarter growth was terrible. Overall, growth has been very, very, very slow. The worst, most anemic recovery on record. One reason it's not been very good is because when all of the money is going to the top, the middle class and poor don't have enough purchasing power to keep the economy going, or to even get it out of first gear. This is not a complicated idea. In fact, it very much is the idea behind the importance of raising the minimum wage. There are still some economists around who say if you raise the minimum wage, you're going to kill jobs. Well, the fact of the matter is, almost all the studies, and I'm not telling you anything you don't know because you've already gone through a decision-making process, but almost all the studies have shown, and there have been a lot of studies, that if you raise the minimum wage, you put more money into the pockets of people who are going to spend it. And they're going to spend it mostly in the local area. And if they spend it in the local area, they create jobs. And not only are you going to create more jobs because more people have more money to spend, but you're also going to bring more people into the labor force who might otherwise say, well, I'm not all that interested in working for that old minimum wage, but if the minimum wage is higher, yes, I might be attracted into the labor force. So that means employers have slightly more choice of whom to hire, which reduces turnover costs. We know this around the country. We've seen it around the country. In 1996, I was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Labor, and I was looking at wages, and I said and one of the things that it seemed to me very important to do was to raise the minimum wage. It had not been raised in years. We had 12 years before Bill Clinton got there of Republican presidents. I don't want to make this partisan tonight in any way. Republican presidents have served this country. Teddy Roosevelt was a good Republican president. Abraham Lincoln. But we hadn't had a minimum wage increase in a long time, and I said to Bill Clinton, don't you think it is time? And he said, well, you know, I think it probably is. Why don't you check with Dick Morris? Now, some of you may remember, Bill Clinton had a pollster named Dick Morris. And Dick Morris did very fast polls. I don't know how he did them so fast. I asked him to do a poll with regard to support for the minimum wage increase in 1996, and he came back the next morning. He said, you won't believe this, 90% positive support for increasing the minimum wage. I was amazed. He had only had 8 hours to do the poll. I think Dick Morris polls his family. I think that's what he does. It's sort of a technique. But anyway, that poll and other polls showed that there was a huge amount of support, and Bill Clinton was interested in pursuing it, and we got Republicans interested in doing it. And there were some economists who said, no, you mustn't raise the minimum wage because it's going to kill jobs. And I suspected not because of the very reason I gave to you just now. And in fact, we did raise the minimum wage. And what happened over the following 4 years was the best job growth in the United States in American history. Now, and I was directly responsible. No, I wasn't. But here's the thing. I'm not suggesting to you that we created jobs by raising the minimum wage per se. All I am suggesting is something more modest, and that is that by hiking the minimum wage, we did not kill jobs. And you can see that again and again around the country. If you simply took the minimum wage in 1968 and you adjusted it for inflation, you increased it just in terms of the purchasing power of the minimum wage in 1968, that minimum wage today would be way over $10 an hour. And then if you added in and adjusted it for productivity improvements, because the average American worker is much more productive today than he or she was in 1968, you get way over $15 an hour. And that's just keeping it aligned with purchasing power and productivity. You're not actually doing anything more than that. So it's not all, I don't mean to detract from the radical, far-sighted, prescient Seattle decision to raise the minimum wage. I'm just saying that it's just logical. It's just inherently logical. The most amazing thing to me is why other places in other cities have not done it. Now, it could have something to do with a factor that I find sometimes embarrassing to talk about. Because as we've seen widening inequality, as we've seen more and more money, wealth, income coalesce, concentrate at the very top. I said to you before, I'm not a class warrior at all, but this is something that does worry me. When you have all that money going to the top, that money starts infecting and undermining politics. You see, that's... Part of the problem of inequality is not just that you rob the middle class and the poor of enough purchasing power to keep the economy going, but you also start corroding, corrupting, and undermining the democratic system. Money and power are interchangeable. Even before that shameful Supreme Court decision, which I think is one of not only, it's right down there with Dred Scott and Bush against Gore. And of course, I'm talking about Citizens United against the Federal Election Commission, and then McCutcheon. I thought you couldn't even get worse than Citizens United, then you get McCutcheon. I mean, what has happened is you have a perfect storm. You've got all of that money, income, and wealth at the very top, and then you have the Supreme Court opening the floodgates to allowing all that money, income, and wealth to fundamentally undermine our democracy, making it harder for every state, every locale, certainly harder for the federal government, to do things like raising the minimum wage, or do other things that are necessary, that are absolutely critical, expanding the earned income tax credit, for example. Now, your eyes just glazed over. I saw that. Never before has there been so important a public policy that fewer people knew about than the earned income tax credit. It's a wage supplement. We should expand that. We should also, and this should not take a great deal of political capital if we didn't have so much money destroying politics. We ought to be investing in early childhood education and our K-12 education. And also make public higher education affordable. Making higher education affordable. This is not... You know, we did this. I mean, we had... Somebody in this room must remember the GI Bill. Anybody remember? Anybody remember the GI Bill? And then in the 1950s, we supported an entire generation of young people in terms of... the University of California, Berkeley, where I teach, tuition and fees in 1955 were zero. We had a public higher education system that was expanding and charging nothing on the same principle as our K-12 system. We understood higher education as a public good, not as an individual investment. It was a public good. Where did that go? Why don't we understand that anymore? I mean, the same thing has to do with health care. I mean, the Affordable Care Act, I believe, is a big advance, but why not a single-payer plan? It's obvious. I mean, Medicare for all, even a public option would have been helpful. We can move in that direction. All I want to stress with you is that one reason we're having such a hard time moving in directions that respond and counteract widening inequality in this country is because you have one of the corollaries of widening inequality, which is all of that money coming down and undermining politics and undermining our political system. The other problem with regard to widening inequality is that, and here's an interesting thing, political scientists over the years have studied widening inequality and seen that there is a direct correlation with the degree of inequality and the degree of polarization in politics. In other words, you see very high inequality in the 1890s, 1900, again in the 1920s, and you have very high political polarization, almost gridlock. And then very low inequality in the 1950s, 1960s, and you actually have a lot of nonpartisan activity, and then partisanship starts rising again as inequality starts rising, and now, guess what? We can't get anything done, certainly in Washington, it is just gridlock. What does inequality have to do with political polarization? Nobody knows exactly. That is, political scientists have seen the correlation. They haven't been able to figure out direction of causation, but I think it is pretty clear. I think that because people increasingly feel themselves working harder and harder and getting nowhere, they get frustrated. Naturally, it's human. They get angry. And as they get frustrated and as they get angry, they create the possibility for politicians to prey upon and take advantage of that anger through the politics of resentment, scapegoating. Everybody would like a simple answer. Why am I working harder and harder? The game seems rigged. Who's to blame? And so you have some I'm not saying all politicians by any means, but you have some politicians and even some media outlets. I won't name names. Bill O'Reilly. No, I won't. You know, Bill O'Reilly accuses me of being a communist. I am not, nor have I ever been a member of the Communist Party. But the point is that you get a kind of politics of resentment in America that splits people off from one another. And the media is merely reflecting it. It's taking advantage of it, but it's also reflecting it, as are politicians. I was on a television show not that long ago debating economic policy with the chief economist who had been the chief economist for John McCain in the 2008 election, and we discovered that we agreed on much more than we disagreed. And I thought it was a good modeling experience. You know, the public needs to see Democrats and Republicans agree, and we came to a station break, and the producer said into my earbud, I said, "We're doing pretty well, right?" She said, "No." I said, "Why not? I thought we're doing pretty well." And she said, "No, you've got to be angrier." I said, "I don't want to be angrier. Why should I be angry?" She said, "Because you've got people all over the country surfing through hundreds of channels, and they're going to stop only when they see a fight." Kind of a gladiator mud wrestling philosophy of media. And I said, I don't want to do that. She said, you really do have to. I said, no. She said, "We've got 10 seconds left. You've got to be angrier." And I said, "No." She said, "You must." And at that point, I lost my temper. But this is what we are up against. You know, I travel around the country a great deal, and I talk to a lot of people. In fact, I actually have been trying, although this is an exception, I try to spend more of my time in so-called red states than I do blue states. And I was in Tennessee and North Carolina last week, and what I have found is that most people who describe themselves, and many of you, presumably, who describe yourselves as Republicans, you are very decent, very commonsensical, and I've enjoyed conversing. I mean, we only learn when we talk with people who disagree with us. That's how we learn. And one of the problems is that so many of us are in our bubbles. We are segregating not only by income, but we are also segregating by belief. We want to be surrounded by people who agree with us. And it's just very enjoyable to be in a cocoon, so you don't have to ever have anything you believe challenged, but that's not the way we learn. I drive, whenever I can, my Mini Cooper. I have a little Mini Cooper, and I drive it across the country, from coast to coast. I drove it when I first went out to Berkeley, where I now teach. I drove it from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California, are really the same city. I mean, the climate is slightly different, but they're basically the same. So I was driving from, the same city to the same city, but I tried to create a route and enough time so that I could talk to a lot of people along the way, and I enjoyed myself. This was a number of years ago. I discovered that there were no Mini Coopers in the center of the United States. Did you know that? There were none, absolutely none. And I was in a gas line. I was waiting for gas in I think it was Oklahoma City, and some truckers, big guys, came up to my Mini Cooper. I was sitting in the Mini Cooper, and they tapped on the window, and I lowered the window, and they said, "What is this?" I said, this is a Mini Cooper." "A Mini what?" I said, it's a Mini Cooper. It's designed in England, but its parts are coming from all over the United States and all over the world. And they said, but how does anybody fit in there? Now, I had a decision to make. And I opened the door, and I got out, and I stood up, and I said, "No problem." And they looked at me, kind of forlorn. And I said, "Well, you see, I'm from Massachusetts, and we're all under 5 feet tall." But then we had a good discussion. We talked about politics, and we talked about all sorts of things, and I've enjoyed my discussions, but we're not talking to each other nearly enough. In fact, many of us are seduced by a number of mythologies. They are economic mythologies, and they're mythologies that are propounded by people who either don't know the reality, or they know the reality and would rather that we'd not know the reality. One of the mythologies we've talked about already, that is, you can't raise the minimum wage without causing jobs to be lost. I gave you the truth. But that mythology is used all over the country, and it's drummed into people's heads over and over and over again. Here's another mythology, that the rich are the job creators, and they need tax cuts in order to create jobs. Now, that used to be called supply-side economics or trickle-down economics. Here's the problem with that idea is that we tried it. You know, there are very few economic ideas that have actually been tried in practice. This one has been unfortunate enough to have been tried in practice. We had some supply-side tax cuts under Ronald Reagan and then again under George W. Bush, and guess what? Nothing trickled down. Nothing positive trickled down. The median wage was flat or dropping, and has been over 30 years in terms of adjusted for inflation. We've tried it. Supply-side economics doesn't work. Besides, the rich are not the job creators. The job creators, as Nick Hanauer keeps reminding us in that wonderful film that Nick starred in called Inequality for All, which David only saw 5 times. And David, what's stopping you from a 6th time? But as Nick keeps on reminding us, and it's absolutely true, the job creators are not the people at the top. The job creators are the people in the middle and below. They are the ones who create the jobs because it's their purchasing and it's their buying that inspire and create incentives for businesses to expand. Without them, you wouldn't. It's the same logic as the minimum wage that we just talked about. Or here's another, the third mythology, that somehow corporations need lower taxes in order to create jobs. Now, anybody who believes this, let me tell you something. American corporations are now sitting on over $2 trillion of cash. They don't know what to do with it. They're buying back their own shares of stock, which is the most unimaginative thing you can possibly think of. Instead of investing in new R&D or expanding, they don't need additional tax cuts. What they ought to do with their money is pay their employees more. I mean, this is something... This is not new. Henry Ford, in 1913, he understood that if you pay employees, he had employees on his Model T Ford line, he paid them twice what the going rate was for factory employees, with the idea that other competitors would have to do the same, and if everybody raised their wages, there would be more purchasers of Model T Fords and other automobiles, and he was exactly right. That's exactly how he made so much money, by lifting wages. Here's another mythology, and a dangerous one. The way we get more jobs is we reduce wages overall. Have you heard this one? I heard this stated articulately, I mean very, very specifically by Michelle Bachmann, a representative like Michelle Bachmann. No, be respectful. Michelle Bachmann she's no longer, she was a congressperson, and she said that the way we reduce unemployment, in fact, we could get rid of unemployment altogether if we got rid of the minimum wage completely. Now, there is a certain diabolical logic to that. That is, if we were willing, all of us, to work for a nickel an hour, or maybe a penny an hour, maybe we would all have jobs. In fact, slavery was a full employment system. Do you see the absurdity? I mean, the goal cannot be just employment. The goal is employment with good jobs. That is the goal. To just say the goal is employment and to assume that everybody's being paid too much and what we want to do is get jobs and wages down puts logic completely on its head. And the fifth related mythology is that people are paid what they are worth. Now, you've heard this. To some extent, this has got to be correct because they're paid what they're worth in the market. It's got kind of a tautology. If they're paid what they're worth in the market, that means the market must be paying them what they're worth. But that is not a terribly sophisticated logic. In fact, that is a trivial and dumb logic. Buried in that statement that people are paid what they're worth is a moral claim that is hidden, but it is heard by people all over this country. If you are not paid very much, you're not worth very much. If you're paid huge amounts, you must be worth a huge amount in terms of society. Now, let me tell you something. I think some of the most valuable people in terms of society who I have ever met are teachers and social workers. And I could add in nurses and childcare workers. And I could add in home health care providers. And I could add in a lot of people who are providing all kinds of care and attention and love to a lot of people. They get paid very, very little. Are they worth little? They are worth a fortune. On the other hand, look at a hedge fund manager. Now, I don't want to insult anybody, and if you happen to be a hedge fund manager, I like you. I don't in any way disparage you, but I want to raise some questions about your social worth. Because if you are simply moving money or hedging against hedges, and a lot of hedge fund managers, they're hedging against hedges who are hedging against hedges. They're involved in fact, I'm not going to limit my comment to hedge fund managers. I'm also going to go to private equity managers and even venture into investment banking and some other of the high levels of finance that got us into trouble in 2008 with their derivatives and derivatives on derivatives. I ran into, right after the crash of 2008, I ran into a fellow who I worked with in the Clinton administration, Bob Rubin, who was Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Treasury. I was Secretary of Labor. People come up to me and say it sometimes and say, "Aren't you Bob Rubin?" And I say, "No. No." And I asked Bob Rubin that right after the crash of 2008, I saw him in a conference, and I said, "Bob, what happened? I mean, you were executive chair of the executive committee at Citigroup, so you probably know what happened. Just explain it to me." And he said it was a perfect storm, a perfect storm. And I said, "What does that mean, a perfect storm?" And he said, well, just everything worked out the worst possible way you could imagine in ways that nobody could have foreseen. Well, maybe that's right, but in terms of everything that I read, everything that I understood, everybody who I interviewed, everything that I tried to get into my head about what happened, it wasn't a perfect storm. It was a concocted storm. In other words, the biggest banks, they took risks with your money and my money. And unfortunately, the only thing that actually, I was very proud to be part of the Bill Clinton administration, but in 1999, Bill Clinton did something that I don't think he should have done. He got rid of the Glass-Steagall Act. And that was important to have, because that separated investment banking from commercial banking. And when you had investment banking and commercial banking together, you had the possibility that bankers would take a lot of risks with other people's money, and some of that money was insured money. It's sort of a rerun of the savings and loan disaster. And on top of that, you didn't really have any controls on the insurers who were supposed to be insuring the money and the risks that the banks were taking. AIG, for example. I don't want to dredge all this up. This is pretty awful old history, but I want to just dredge it up for the purpose of reminding you that these people, many of them, made tens, 20s, 30s of millions of dollars a year. In fact, 3 years ago, in the middle of a very, very anemic recovery, the 15 highest paid hedge fund managers got paid $1 billion each. Now, again, I'm not a class warrior, but I want to raise this issue, just this question with you. Because if we have people like home health care workers and teachers and nurses and social workers and people who are custodians of some of the most important and valuable things in our society, such as our children and our elderly people and others who desperately need help, and they're getting paid almost nothing. And you have people who are gambling in ways that potentially ruin the economy. And in that case, in 2008, many of those people did not pay any price. Nobody was jailed. They're too big to jail, too big to fail, too big to curtail. And they're getting paid $1 billion. Well, it seems to me that all of that is evidence enough that the proposition that you're paid what you're worth can't possibly be true. I come across people, in fact, when I was in Knoxville, Tennessee last week, I came across a young woman who told me that she was not doing very well economically. And we had a little conversation. We didn't have much time, but I said, well, tell me what's going on. And she started to tear up. She started to cry. She said that she was holding down 3 jobs. And she was trying to get enough money together to eat and to have a place to live. And she was not making it, and her health was deteriorating. And she was going to be out on the street. And she started to cry. And she said, "I'm so ashamed." And what I said back to her is what I desperately hope everybody understands. If you're holding down 3 jobs, it's not your fault. You have nothing to be ashamed of. You are doing everything you possibly can. You're not losing ground because you are blameworthy. There is something called an economic system. It's organized in a certain way. Right now, it's not organized in a way that rewards most people for the work they do. People don't have, as they did 40 or 50 years ago, most people don't have, for example, a union behind them. They need a union behind them. Because a union gave and still gives, but a union provides bargaining power. In union, there really is strength. In the 1950s, 35% of American workers were unionized. And that meant that so many workers were unionized that even the non-union workers and their employers got the benefits of those prevailing wage and benefit agreements. But now, in the private sector in the United States, fewer than 7% of our workers are unionized, which means that workers don't really have the bargaining power they need. It is not their fault. It is not the fault of this young lady who is in tears, feeling like a failure, feeling ashamed. You see, one of the problems with the "you're paid what you work" moralizing is that it makes people who are not doing well feel like not only a failure, but feel shame. They feel ashamed of where they are. And they don't reach out to other people for help, and they don't reach out to other people to organize them, to organize. And what they need to do is feel enough confidence and enough power that they join with others, and joining with others gives them even more confidence, gives them even more power, because in union and in political organization, there is strength. And so what we need to do, and you have already done this in Seattle, and you're going to do more of it, and there's a lot more to do in terms of paid family and medical leave, for example, paid sick leave, many of the other things we've talked about tonight. What you can do and what we can do, all of us are getting inspired from what you achieved. We have got to counteract and create the countervailing power that is needed in our politics and in our economy to give average people, once again, the kind of say over their lives, the kind of political voice, the kind of economic power that Americans once had. This is not a zero-sum game, by the way. The rich in this country would do better with a smaller share of a rapidly growing economy than they're doing now with a huge share of an economy that's barely growing at all. But they bought a lot of lies, and they are, some of them, financing a lot of mythologies and a lot of lies. The first step toward the kind of organization and countervailing power that I'm talking about is to know the truth, to spread the truth, to know what it is that makes this economy function, to know that the center of the economy are working people who are getting paid adequate wages, to know that upward mobility and equal opportunity are the guiding principles not only of the economy, but also of our entire democracy. If we don't remember that, if we don't cherish that, we have very little to hold on to. So Seattle, let me thank you for what you've accomplished. Let me thank you for setting the light and a beacon light for the rest of this country. And let me thank you for what you will accomplish also in the future. Thank you.
Joining us right now, we have Essex Porter, who covers government and politics for Cairo TV. Representative Justin Farrell, who represents the citizens of the 46th District. Nick Hanauer, who is co-author of The True Patriot, The Garden of Democracy. He's also a movie star. So I'm going to direct a question to a panelist, and then they're going to hand off to Professor Reich, I believe, unless something drastic happens. And then we'll all be surprised. So, the first question, how does the redistribution of wealth tie into decreasing resources due to population and climate change? I assume overpopulation and climate change. It's a question about the connection between economics and environmentalism. And how about we go to Nick?
Does this work? Yes? That is a great question and a deep conundrum, and I'll just reframe it, which is, if we have a world in which more people have more stuff, how do we not annihilate ourselves? Is that a fair reconstruction of that? Yeah, and the answer, and there's a complex answer to that question, I think, but it requires us to step back a little bit and acknowledge that the ways in which we presently, the ways in which, the orthodox economic paradigm defines growth and prosperity leads us to a terrible place. GDP, which is gross domestic product, is basically the sum of the value of outputs of the economy, is a terrible way to measure human progress. And it leads us into a trap that is very, very difficult. But I think that one of the great challenges of the age is to redefine prosperity from outputs to outcomes, and to acknowledge that the measure of prosperity really is the degree to which lived experience for participants in the economy improves. Right? And I have a collaborator that runs the Institute for New Economic Thinking at Oxford University, and he and I call this the accumulation of solutions to human problems. That really is what prosperity is. Because the far left answer to this challenge is, North Korea, where we all sort of turn off the lights and, shiver in the cold, probably isn't going to work. We have to acknowledge human striving and the need, the requirement that we find ways to improve the circumstances, improve lived experience. So the trick really will become changing our definitions of what growth is from an output-based model, where basically the more stuff we burn, somehow the better it looks, to the degree to which we improve the lived experience of the people in our economy. And I think there are constructive ways to do that that can resolve the tension between these two problems.
Okay. Professor Reich?
Well, let me just add quickly that there really are two ways in which environmentalism and fighting climate change are completely consistent with creating a lot of good jobs. One is if we understand, and this builds exactly on what Nick was saying, if we understand that there are a lot of good jobs out there in terms of creating non-carbon-based energy sources. Wind and solar, for example, are almost, in fact, in many respects, competitive with carbon. And there are a lot of potential jobs in wind and solar and in various other aspects of green technologies and a green environmental movement if we simply understand that we need to train people for them, but also that we develop the incentives in the economy to generate the desire, the demand for those kinds of non-carbon-based technologies. The second point, though, that I think needs emphasizing is that as the environment changes and as we suffer the consequences of climate change, who are the first people to suffer? They are not the rich. Generally speaking, the wealthy of the world are going to do fine. They are going to get the water they need, they're going to get the food they need, they're going to not suffer the consequences of drought, they're going to be on higher land, so they're not going to be flooded out. And that itself is a political problem. Because unless we know that we are all in this together, it's going to be hard to get the political will to do something about it.
Okay, the second question we'll send to Essex. Although the stimulus has helped the economy, at what point past the $17 trillion national debt, whether it be 20, 30, or 40 trillion, would it affect the economy? If interest rates remain low and stock markets good, will it not ever make a difference?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I missed the very first word. While something has helped the economy?
Although the stimulus, that's a very important part, yeah.
Okay. Okay. You know, I'm a reporter, not an economist. Here's what I've, certainly seen in my reporting. One thing I've seen in my reporting, we've reported this, we talk so much about a large stimulus. Remember, a large portion of the stimulus was really a direct tax cut to each American. It wasn't necessarily put into roads or put into building schools. It was, sending out money to each American. I have read economists say that part of the problem with that is that in desperate straits, Americans saved what they could and paid off their credit cards with the rest, and it didn't generate the sort of economic activity that a large stimulus you might think would. The question here seems to go to the idea of when should we stop? I guess there are a lot of people out there I still run into and interview people who have low wages or who don't have jobs, and they would probably say it's not time to stop yet.
Professor Reich?
Yep. Well, the best way I have of describing the deficit issue is to share with you that when I was a little boy in the early 1950s, my father, who was otherwise a very wise man, said to me that I and my children and my children's children and their children will be paying down the debt created by Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, I was only 5. I didn't know what a debt was, but it scared me silly. I had nightmares about the federal debt. My father, by the way, is now 100, and he sees the wisdom of my ways, not his. Because what happened to the federal debt? The Franklin D. Roosevelt debt, which, by the way, in 1946 was about 110% of the total national economy, the total GDP. And people were very worried about it. But what happened? Remember, the issue is not debt per se. It's the debt relative to the national economy. It's the ratio of the debt to the GDP. And if you understand that that's the issue, that FDR debt actually disappeared because the economy grew so quickly in the 1950s that by the time I was 7, nobody ever talked about it. My children have never mentioned it once. I have a 6-year-old granddaughter, and she doesn't stop talking, but she's never mentioned Franklin D. Roosevelt's debt. And so remember the denominator. The deficit and the debt right now, the debt is down to 72% of GDP, too high, but it's not impossible. The deficit is down to less than 3% of GDP, which is actually lower than it has been on average over the last 40 years. So this is manageable if we get the economy back on track.
We have a gotcha question for Jessen. Do you support the use of an amendment to overturn the Citizens United ruling?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay.
Good evening, by the way. So, as a state legislator who is up for re-election in a very liberal district without a real contest, there is no doubt that money in this process, which is, again, a liberal district with, it isn't a huge impact to my race, but in our statewide races, in our swing district races, certainly it is. And certainly it undermines the average voter's ability to impact who their elected leaders are. Professor Reich said so eloquently what a true disaster this decision was, and that it really has ushered in a new Gilded Age in the way our moneyed interests and our political interests are aligning, and it is incredibly toxic to our political system. And so we need to amend the Constitution if that is the way we need to go. And I am fully supportive of whatever I can do as a legislator, a state legislator, to help be a part of that battle.
But if I could jump in, how do you restrict the money without restricting speech?
Is money speech? That 1970, what is it, 6, Buckley v. Vallejo, I mean, that fundamental question, that fundamental frame to me is totally troubling. Is a corporation a person? Is it a civic person in the same way that I am or any of you are? No. And those frames have been incredibly troubling and hugely problematic in our political discourse and the actual political outcomes. Nick mentioned the word outcomes, and it has had a tremendous impact on the outcomes in this state and elsewhere.
And Professor Reich, do you support an amendment?
Oh, absolutely. I'm chair of a citizens group called Common Cause. And Common Cause... and we've been fighting for years for campaign finance reform. Finally, McCain-Feingold came along. That was a Common Cause product. And then came along, unfortunately, the Supreme Court. You know, I will believe that corporations are people when Texas executes a corporation. But here's the good news. The good news is that there are 5 justices, only 5, who believe that corporations are people under the First Amendment. Now, I don't know how many of you remember your history in terms of the 1930s, but much of the New Deal was struck down because there were 5 justices who kept striking it down. But somewhere along the late 1930s, one of those justices changed his mind. And all we need is one of those 5 to change his mind. It's a he. A he. And by the way, here is a trivial question for you. The name of the 1930s justice who changed his mind. Class? His name was Justice Roberts. You see, anything can happen. But if that doesn't happen, we do have to have a constitutional amendment.
We've got a few variations on this question, and I guess this will go to Nick. With the needed rise of the minimum wage to $15 an hour, should those in lower level jobs that have worked at them for, say, 15 years and slowly worked up to a barely livable wage also get a raise of some percentage?
Well, I mean, I think that certainly, you know, the point of raising the minimum wage is to raise the floor. And if you work for an enterprise that pays lots of people the present minimum wage, but you earn more than them, when the minimum wage goes up, you will find that your employer will need to pay you more than them. So that, you know, the beauty of the minimum wage is it pushes all wages up and should have a compressing effect upwards towards the middle class. You know, indeed, that's what the data suggests happens, and you know, I have no doubt that that's what will happen. But you know, I reject this argument that I have heard before that raising the floor somehow penalizes people who have worked hard already to get above the floor. We're all in this together, and everyone benefits from an economy where every worker earns enough money to participate in the economy and enough money so that they do not require other people to pay taxes to support them, even people who earn a little bit more than the minimum wage now.
Do you have anything to add?
Nick put it very well. I don't have anything to add.
All right. This one, well, we'll direct to Essex, but you're a reporter, so we're going to sort of phrase it differently. The question is, why have blue-collar workers, the losers in the current economy, abandoned the Democrats, and what will bring them back to the fold? So I want to ask you, Essex, if that's something that you've seen as you cover the economy and politics.
Well, what I do see as I cover politics is a feeling that politics has failed people. And so when people communicate with me, often the questions are very sharp, like, why didn't you ask this, and why didn't you ask that? So it may be that feeling of disconnection, and disenfranchisement from the political system that leads people to those feelings.
Okay. And Professor Reich, do you?
Well, I certainly agree with that. I can also reflect back on my free-floating focus group recently in Tennessee and in North Carolina and in a few other so-called red states. And these are states, by the way, and I picked these states specifically because these are states that chose not to raise Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, even though the federal government would pay 100% of the cost for the first 3 years and 90% thereafter. So you have working class people who would have been subsidized in terms of their health care who live in these states and are still voting for the same Republicans. And so I was curious. I would ask people about this very phenomenon. Do you know that your leaders have decided not to choose for that Medicaid expansion? And what I got back is that, number one, they were very disillusioned with politics at all. They didn't really care. They didn't want to even talk about politics. But number two, they did not know this. Number three, what they did know was that their legislators were very active in making sure that religious symbolism could be displayed in the public parks, that women, if they wanted to have an abortion, would have to have a waiting period, and maybe the abortion clinics would have to go through various hoops before they could do it, and also that gay marriage would not necessarily be as easy, or in other words, what these people were focusing on, and I think that what they were focusing on was intentionally a smokescreen for these underlying economic issues, were social issues that basically were themselves controversial but not advancing anybody's economic agenda at all. We're distracting people from what they were really all about and what they needed.
It'd be it would be great to hear from the one politician on the stage on this question.
Well, the word that has been in my mind is the issue of power. And that when people turn away from the civic realm, they're giving up their power as citizens. And for whatever reason, in the last 40 years, especially as we've become more gridlock, as things have become more unequal, we have seen people turn away from politics. And Nick's friend, Eric, Lou, really talks powerfully about power and the fact that we all need to reinvigorate the civic space as a place where we reclaim our power in politics. And again, it gets back to the issue of money, but at the end of the day, I still deeply believe in what Frank Bruni in a New York Times op-ed said called our noble and troubled democracy. And it is troubled right now, but it is also very noble to jump in and elbow your way into the civic realm, because it belongs to all of us. And I think fundamentally that's the issue. And I think what's so powerful about the minimum wage fight is it marries the issue of economic power and political power, and we need to keep our mind on that.
So the next question is, how can we protect public education from the influences of private corporations? And There is a PS that says, "I love inequality for all and show it in my classroom," smiley face. So I think that was directed at you. Does anybody on the panel want to address that more than anybody else on the panel?
Oh, I'm happy to address it,
Why don't you address it?
since I'm a teacher at a public university. Let me just say that public education is one of this nation's most important legacies. But what's happening is it is being undermined in a variety of ways. One way it's being undermined is the substitution of test-taking for thinking. And, you know, I've been in many classrooms. My teacher, my sister is a public school teacher, and she all the time says the great enjoyment of teaching is being drained out of the classrooms because we are simply drilling young people to take tests. When we teach young people to take tests, all we are doing is preparing them to take tests. The economy is not about taking tests. The economy is about solving and identifying new problems. The private sector has, I think, a role to play, obviously. I mean, look at the chalk that we use. Look at the desks. I mean, the private sector is inevitably part of the school system. But when the private sector begins to take over schools, the problem there is that you substitute a for-profit model for public values that cannot be reduced to dollars and cents.
I would also add, you know, we all know that the state legislature is being held in contempt by our court, and not only is there an issue of a private sector model in what is essentially a public good, but also the fact that our state government is not stepping up to plate and funding, frankly, my daughter's, 700-kid elementary school. And it is really something that we need to accomplish. I see my legislative colleagues in the gallery over here. But it isn't just using a private sector model that's the problem. It's that we are not investing in our public good, which is our K through 12 system.
We have another question for the panel. Income inequality is even worse for most populations of color. How do we address race-based inequality?
Well, clearly, you have to address that illegal but still continuing discrimination. The laws need to be enforced, and then, society has to rise together, right? If it feels like, and I've seen this in my reporting, if it feels like one group is getting an advantage over another, then all there is a fight over the shrinking pie. When groups come together and feel like everyone is benefiting, then there is advancement. But I will say, I look around this room, and I think there were maybe two things. One thing the professor was wrong about. I seriously doubt there are very many Republicans in this room. And there's probably
if there are, please put up your hand.
There are people of color in this room, but not many more than the number of Republicans. And and that raises a question about the quality and the viability and the effectiveness of a progressive movement when everyone is clearly not a part.
If I could just also speak to that, one of the techniques used in this country by people who don't want to see positive social change is to divide and conquer. That is to tell the white working class that the reason they're not getting ahead is because of people who are minorities, who are Latinos and African Americans. And that divide and conquer strategy is an old strategy, but what we must understand is not only are there more white people in poverty than there are African Americans and Latinos, but unless we create a poor people's and working class progressive movement in which people are working together across races, we cannot progress at all.
And I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, but again, from a legislation perspective, if we're interested in pursuing something like minimum wage statewide, that means that as a fundamental core principle, it has to include all workers. It has to include all geographies. It has to include all sectors. And this is one of those places where there certainly is a divide and conquer mindset. And so when we are bringing these battles that Seattle is waging successfully to the state, we have to make sure that there are some core principles that we're really focused on.
We have a bunch of questions that touch on this, and it's something that I've encountered a lot in Seattle as the minimum wage increase happened. How much will inflation increase, or will inflation increase over the course of as the minimum wage goes up over the years? Nick, yeah.
So the inflation argument is a specious one. The idea that we should not raise the minimum wage because it will create inflation is like arguing that Somalia is better than Switzerland because a ham sandwich in Somalia costs 10 cents and in Switzerland it costs $15. Clearly, one of those economies is superior to the other, and one of those places is a fun place to live and the other is somewhat more difficult. Our goal as a society is to create a high-wage, high-quality economy, one that everyone's included and one everyone will benefit from. And that's why the fact that pushing wages up a little bit may in turn make some prices go up a little bit too isn't a bad thing. In many ways, it's a good thing and the sign that good things are happening. But to be very clear, our problem is that lots and lots of workers can hardly get by, and if you raise the wage in the United States from $7.25 to $15 for those workers will earn 100% more, but Walmart will have to raise their prices 1.25% or something like that as a consequence of that increase. And so for those workers, that's a fantastic trade. And for people who don't benefit from that wage increase well up the income ladder, well, they can afford that 1% increase anyway. And so, again, the beauty of a capitalist system, if it's structured right, is it really can be a virtuous cycle that benefits everyone. As wages increase, businesses have more customers, and the more customers they have, the more workers they require, which puts pressure on the labor markets, which increases wages and the need for more workers, which in turn creates more business for businesses. And that's really the virtuous cycle that we're trying to create, that the minimum wage fight that we're having in the country represents, and why people at all ends of the economic stratum should be supportive of it.
But you've heard this criticism that when the minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour, or even you have a 30 or a 50 or a 60% increase, there are people who are going to lose their jobs. There is going to be dislocation. What do you say to that person who loses their jobs to say that it's worth it?
Essex, there may be an individual who loses their job as a consequence of the minimum wage going up, but there is absolutely no doubt that high-wage places are high-employment places. You show me a low-wage place, I will show you a poverty-stricken hellhole. Washington State has the highest minimum wage of any state in the nation. all right? If the trickle-down ideas that you just expressed were correct, we would have slid into the ocean. Washington State pays 30% more than the federal minimum wage, and Washington State is currently creating more small business jobs than virtually any state in the country. Washington State, Seattle, Washington pays tipped workers 427% more than the federal tip minimum of $2.13. Tipped workers in our state make $9.32 plus tips. If the trickle-down ideas were correct, there would be no restaurants in Seattle, Washington. How could there be, right? We pay 400% more than the federal minimum. And yet, the restaurant business in Seattle, Washington is among the most robust in the country. Why? Because when restaurants pay restaurant workers enough so that even they can afford to eat in restaurants, it's actually good for the restaurant business. Because Essex, the fundamental law of capitalism is when workers earn more money, businesses have more customers and require more workers. And it is simply ridiculous, this idea that Speaker Boehner is out peddling that, if you raise the price of employment, guess what happens? You get less of it. As if this is a physical law, like, mass times acceleration equals force. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. These economic laws are not physical laws. They are social laws, like bedtime is 9 p.m. Right? These are man-made constructions, and we can define them any way we want. Well, actually, in my house, women-made.
Professor Reich, do you want to break this up?
I want to say a couple of things. First of all, bedtime is not 9 p.m. Secondly, although there are adjustments in every economy continuously, people lose jobs and people gain jobs. And there will undoubtedly be some adjustments in Seattle in terms of people losing and gaining. But the net number of jobs is going to go up because, as Nick said, when you have more people with more money in their pockets to buy more, that generates more demand, which generates more jobs. This is much more of a law. It's sort of, let's call it the 10 p.m. law. The other thing I want to say is that there is no inflation. Can I just repeat this? There's no inflation anywhere, partly because you have in this country now, and you've had for years, a lot of underutilized capacity. You have a labor participation rate in the United States that is lower than it is and has been for 30 years. And you have very little power, unfortunately, among workers to demand raises for the reasons we've already talked about. When you have that much underutilized capacity and you have no labor power, you have no inflation. The biggest problem the Federal Reserve Board is now struggling with is the lack of inflation. The possibility of, and this is the big danger, deflation. Prices going down, because once prices start going down, then what happens? Consumers hold back because they expect prices to go down further, and then the Fed doesn't know what to do. Then you get into the kind of deflationary cycle that Japan has been in for more than a decade. Our enemy is not inflation, our enemy is deflation. If you can contrive a little bit of inflation here in Seattle, that would be a great contribution.
Yeah, and Essex, I just want to add that I have no doubt that there are businesses out there that are predicated on paying workers poverty wages, that they have business models that depend on it. And those businesses will either change or go out of business as wages rise. I just don't have a problem with that, and I am willing to look anybody in the eye who can't find a way to pay workers a living wage and say, you should find another line of work.
I'm going to have to put a cap on this because I am the moderator and it is 9 o'clock and it is bedtime. So the last card The last card of the evening says in very large letters, "We love you, Robert," and I think we can all agree with that. And the question is, so when is the revolution?
And the answer is starting tonight.
Thank you to Town Hall. Buy books from Elliott Bay Book Company over there. Thank you to Professor Reich and everyone on the panel. Good night.